You want to know what I see when I look at your fields, Mason? I see a man who bought land he never should have bought. Floodplain's floodplain. Water goes where water wants to go.
Behind him, two of his site foremen stood with clipboards, watching the brown water lap at what used to be Mason's South 40. One of them was already laughing before Denning finished the sentence. "This ain't personal," Denning said, tilting his head like he was doing Mason a kindness. "It's just physics. Somebody's land was always gonna take the water this season. Turns out it's yours." Mason stood ankle-deep at the edge of his own driveway, his daughter's rain boots, a size too small now, sitting forgotten on the porch steps behind him, and said nothing. He'd learned, in the 11 months since his wife died and the 18 months since Denning first offered to buy him out, that giving this man a reaction was the same as giving him a gift. "Tell you what," Denning said, already turning back toward his truck. "When you're done bailing out your basement, you give my office a call. Offer's still on the table. Might be a little lower by Friday, though. Water's not real patient with a man's asking price." He didn't know what was sitting under 6 inches of floodwater on the far edge of that south field. Nobody did yet, not Mason, not Denning, not the two foremen laughing behind him. They were about to find out. And when they did, it was going to cost Carl Denning everything he'd spent a decade burying. Now, to understand what that floodwater was about to uncover, and why Carl Denning standing dry-booted at the edge of Mason Ray's driveway that morning was about to become the single worst mistake of his career, we have to go back 14 months, to the first time Denning's company quietly opened a gate upstream that it had no legal right to touch. If you felt that particular anger watching a man stand in front of a flooded family farm and call another man's ruin just physics, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me what city, what country you're watching this from. I want to see how far this thing reaches before it's over, because the American farmer exists for exactly this moment. Stay with us. Because what that water uncovered, I promise you, was worth every second of what you just watched. Here's what you need to know. Mason Ray's was 36 years old, raising his 8-year-old daughter Lily alone after his wife Angela died of an aggressive cancer 16 months back, working 90 acres along Miller's Fork that had been in Angela's family for 3 generations before Mason ever married into it. 90 acres wasn't much, not next to the operation next door, Denning Agricultural Holdings, 4,000 acres of row crops running clear to the county line, the largest single operation in the region, and the reason Carl Denning had sat on the regional levee and drainage board for the past 9 years. And here's what nobody understood, not even Mason himself, standing in that floodwater. 14 months earlier, right around the time Angela's diagnosis turned terminal, right around the time Denning first made his first friendly offer to buy Mason out, Denning's company had modified a drainage control gate on the upstream section of Miller's Fork. A gate that, under the original 1970s levee easement agreement recorded with the county, was only supposed to open during genuine emergency overflow conditions, to protect farmland on both sides equally. Denning's engineers had quietly recalibrated it instead to divert excess water preferentially downstream, onto Mason's side of the fork, away from Denning's own 4,000 acres, every single time heavy rain hit the watershed. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't physics like Denning liked to say. It was a decade-old drainage advantage Denning had engineered for his own operation, using a piece of infrastructure that legally belonged to no one company at all, and it had been quietly costing Mason's fields 2 or 3 bad flood events a year ever since, each one a little worse than the one before, each one making Mason's fields a little less viable, and each one making Denning's buyout offers look a little more reasonable to anyone who didn't know better. That's when everything changed, because this flood, the worst one yet, was about to recede in a way none of the others had. Because for the first time in 3 generations, the water was about to rise high enough and pull hard enough at the eroding bank on the south field to expose something that had been buried since before Mason was even born. And here's where it gets worse, because Carl Denning didn't need to guess how close Mason was to breaking. He had someone telling him directly. Ray Kowalski, Mason's foreman, the man who'd worked that farm alongside Angela's father for 20 years before Mason ever showed up, who'd stood beside Mason at Angela's funeral, who Mason trusted with the equipment shed keys and the bank account access and every hard conversation about the farm's future. For the past 8 months, every time Mason mentioned falling behind on the loan, every time he talked about how many more bad seasons he could absorb before the bank called it, Ray had been repeating it back to Denning's operations manager over coffee at the diner in town, in exchange for a standing offer of his own. A supervisor position at Denning Agricultural Holdings, waiting for him the day Mason finally sold. Ray told himself it wasn't betrayal. He told himself Mason was going to lose the farm eventually anyway, flood or no flood, and a man had to look out for his own family too. He had no idea, watching the water rise from his own porch that morning, what was sitting exposed on the eroding bank of that south field. Nobody did, not yet. And it didn't stop at the driveway. That's the part that should make your blood boil, because Carl Denning made a show of Mason's misfortune for weeks afterward, every chance he got. At the co-op 2 days later, he told a group of farmers, loud enough for it to travel, that some men just aren't built for floodplain farming, and that he'd offered to put Ray's out of his misery months ago. Laughter, again. The same easy, comfortable laughter that always seemed to follow Denning around like weather. At the county drainage board meeting the following week, Denning stood up during public comment and, with false concern dripping from every word, suggested the board look into whether some of these smaller floodplain operations are even viable anymore. A suggestion aimed squarely at Mason, in a room full of people who knew exactly who he meant and said nothing. Mason stopped attending those meetings after that. He focused on his daughter, on the wet ruined fields, on the equipment sitting half submerged in his lower barn, and he told the county cleanup crew, when they came through with heavy equipment 2 weeks later to help clear debris off the eroded bank, that he'd handle the south field himself. He didn't want strangers on Angela's family land while it was torn open like this. But here's what nobody knew yet, not even Mason. Walking that eroded bank alone with a shovel and a 5-gallon bucket, clearing debris the water had carried in, he was about to find something that had been sitting 6 feet under that soil since before the original levy agreement was even signed. Here's where the system started working against him, exactly the way it always had. Mason's crop insurance claim, filed the week after the flood, came back under review, pending drainage board assessment. An assessment that, by regional policy, required sign-off from the same levy and drainage board Carl Denning had sat on for 9 years. The bank, hearing about the flood damage before Mason had even finished his own claim paperwork, moved up his loan review by 60 days. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly the way Carl Denning had spent a decade building it to work for him, and against a floodplain farm he'd been engineering to fail since before its owner ever knew there was a fight going on. And nobody on that drainage board saw what was coming next, because at that point, not even Mason understood what he just pulled out of the mud with his own 2 hands. Now here's the part that's going to make you sick, because it's not Carl Denning. It's family or close enough to it. Ray came by that evening, same as always, offering to help Mason haul debris, asking how the insurance claim was going, how the loan review was shaping up, the same careful, casual concern he'd been offering for 8 months. And Mason, exhausted, grieving, still trusting the man who'd stood beside him at his wife's grave, told him everything. The claim delay, the moved-up loan review. And almost as an afterthought, mentioned the strange metal box he'd found buried in the eroded bank that afternoon, still sealed, too corroded to open without tools. Ray didn't think much of it in the moment. He mentioned it to Denning's operations manager the next morning over coffee, the same way he'd mentioned everything else, casual, offhand, not even thinking it mattered. He had no idea what he just handed over. Because when Denning heard sealed metal box, buried on the south bank, his stomach dropped in a way it hadn't dropped in 14 months. He knew exactly what had been buried on that property line back when the original levee easement was surveyed, because his own father had been on the crew that buried it, the same year Denning's family quietly agreed to a drainage arrangement nobody ever recorded honestly with the county. And Carl Denning was not a man who was going to let that box make it into a courtroom without a fight. Mason didn't know Denning had found out. What he knew was simpler. He had a corroded metal box sitting on his kitchen table, and no good way to open it without doing damage to whatever was inside. So he did what any careful farmer would do. He called the County Historical Society, the same office that had helped his father-in-law catalog old farm equipment years back, and asked if they had anyone who could safely open a sealed, decades-old container. A volunteer archivist agreed to come out that Saturday. Here's what nobody told Mason outright, though it would matter later. The county clerk's office fielded a call from Denning Agricultural Holdings that same week, requesting to review the original 1970s levy easement file, a file that, oddly, hadn't been pulled from storage in over a decade. Mason wasn't just recovering from a flood anymore. He was being watched again, from a different direction this time. The archivist came out Saturday morning, worked the corroded latch open carefully with the same tools she used on century-old farm ledgers, and pulled out a set of wax paper-wrapped documents that had survived remarkably intact. Land survey maps, a handwritten construction log, and an original carbon copy levy easement agreement, signed, dated, notarized, laying out exactly how the drainage gate upstream was supposed to operate, split evenly between both properties, with specific language about emergency-only diversion. "Mr. Reyes," she said, "I'd want a records specialist to confirm the legal weight of this, but if I'm reading this correctly, whoever built that gate wasn't following the original agreement. Not even close." For the first time since the flood, Mason felt something close to hope. That hope lasted exactly 4 days. Because that's when Carl Denning showed up at his gate, not with a buyout offer this time, but with a company attorney, and a claim that stopped Mason cold. That any documents recovered from that property were themselves company records, since the original gate infrastructure had been maintained and improved by Denning Agricultural Holdings for decades, and that removing them from the site without company sign-off constituted interference with company property. "I understand you found something out there, Mason," Denning said, standing at the fence with his lawyer's folder in hand. "Whatever it is, I'd strongly recommend you hand it over before this gets complicated for you." But there was something Denning didn't know yet, something about to complicate his plan far more than a grieving single father ever could on his own. Because word travels fast along a watershed, and a call about an old levy easement dispute had already reached someone 2 counties over who'd spent the better part of a career on exactly this kind of case. Her name was Grace Acaffer, a water rights attorney with the State Agricultural Bureau who'd handled 3 prior levy misconduct cases in the region, cases that, until now, had never had physical documentation this clean to work with. Grace called Mason directly after hearing about it from the archivist, an old colleague of hers. "Mr. Reyes, if what I'm hearing about that easement agreement is accurate, this isn't just a property dispute. This could be a decade of engineered flood damage, and I'd like to review everything you have before Denning's company gets anywhere near those documents again." For the first time in this whole ordeal, Mason had someone in his corner who wasn't family, wasn't a neighbor, wasn't obligated to him at all, someone who simply recognized what he was holding and understood exactly what it meant. Hope rose again, real hope this time. But 2 days before Grace was set to review the documents in person, Mason got a call from the county clerk's office. Denning's attorney had filed an emergency motion, a legal claim asserting temporary custodial rights over any and all infrastructure-related materials recovered from the disputed easement area, pending a company review. If it held, even temporarily, the documents would be seized before Grace ever got to examine them properly, locked into a legal limbo that could take months, maybe years, to untangle, time Mason didn't have with a loan review already accelerated and a bank running out of patience. Denning didn't need to win the case. He just needed to stall long enough that there'd be nothing left to prove anything with. And that's when Mason learned from Ray himself, showing up unannounced, guilt written all over his face, exactly how Denning had found out about the box in the first place. "It was me, Mason. I told his operations manager about the box the morning after you found it. I didn't think it mattered, I swear. I didn't know." Mason didn't say anything for a long moment. Every piece slid into place at once. The insurance delay, the accelerated loan review, Denning's lawyer showing up right when the documents were about to be examined properly. None of it had been coincidence. All of it traced back to a casual conversation over coffee his own foreman never thought twice about. The custody hearing was set for 3 days out. 3 days, with a state water rights attorney arriving, a legal claim that could bury the evidence in limbo indefinitely, and a bank that wasn't going to wait around to see how any of it turned out. Nobody knew yet how this was going to end, but everybody in that county was about to find out at once. Mason had 3 days, and he spent the first one doing something Carl Denning never expected a flooded-out single father to have the resources to do. He let Grace Ackafer take the lead, and Grace didn't just prepare a defense against the custody motion. She built a case around one simple, devastating question. If this gate was legitimately maintained and improved by Denning Agricultural Holdings for decades, like they're claiming, she told Mason, there should be permit records, engineering sign-offs, county inspection reports. Let's find out if any of that actually exists. It didn't, because it turned out Denning's company had never filed a single permit for the gate modifications going back 14 years. No engineering review, no county inspection, no paper trail at all. Grace found something else instead. A maintenance log from a subcontractor Denning's company had used years earlier, boxed up in state utility archives, describing custom gate recalibration, client requested non-standard flow diversion. Dated the same year Mason's father-in-law first started noticing the flooding pattern that eventually pushed the older man to sell his majority stake in the farm to his daughter, and later to Mason. Denning's company hadn't just diverted water illegally. They'd done it quietly, off the books, for 14 years, and then tried to claim custodial ownership over the one set of original documents that proved the gate was never supposed to work that way at all. The custody hearing was scheduled at the county courthouse, a small hearing room that filled up fast once word got around. The same crowd, more or less, that had laughed along at the co-op, at the drainage board meeting, at Mason's own flooded driveway. Carl Denning walked in with his attorney, confident as ever, already halfway through a handshake with a board member before he even sat down. He didn't know Grace Ackafer was sitting in the second row with a state case file. He didn't know the archivist had brought the original easement documents in protective sleeves, ready to enter into evidence before anyone could claim custody of them. And he didn't know that Ray, pale, quiet, sitting 3 rows back from where he usually would have stood beside the equipment shed, had spent 3 sleepless nights deciding which side of this he actually wanted to be on when it finally landed. When the judge opened the floor, Grace stood first. Your Honor, before this court considers any custody claim over these documents, I'd like the court to understand what they actually are. She placed the original 1970s easement agreement on the table, alongside the subcontractor's maintenance log. This is the original, legally recorded easement, specifying emergency-only, equal diversion drainage between both properties. This is a maintenance record showing Denning Agricultural Holdings custom recalibrated that gate 14 years ago, without permits, without county inspection, to preferentially flood the Ray's property and protect their own 4,000 acres. Mr. Denning's claim that these are company records asks this court to hand over the only evidence of exactly what his company has been hiding. The room went quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when 40 people realize they're about to be talking about this at the co-op for the next 10 years. Denning's attorney tried to object, but the judge waved him off, flipping through the maintenance log herself. Mr. Denning, the judge said, your motion claims custodial rights based on your company having maintained this gate, but this record shows your company modified it illegally, outside any permitted process, specifically to divert flooding onto a neighboring property. You don't get custody of the evidence proving you broke the agreement. Denning's confidence didn't leave his face right away. That was the worst part for him. It just sort of stayed there, frozen, while everything behind his eyes fell apart in real time. This is absurd, he said, too loud now, the confidence cracking at the edges. That gate's been maintained by my company for illegally, Grace said. For 14 years off the books, at a direct cost to the Ray's family's crops, equipment, and stability, while your public statements called every flood just physics. There's a maintenance log with your company's name on it that says otherwise. And that's when Ray stood up. Every head in the room turned. Mason's breath caught beside him. "I need to say something," Ray said, voice unsteady but clear. "I've worked that farm for 20 years. I know exactly which floods hit hard and which ones didn't, and it was never random. I told Denning's people things I shouldn't have because I wanted a job with his company. I didn't understand what I was handing him, but I understand now. And I'm not going to sit here and let him make this about a flood being nobody's fault." The room erupted, not laughter this time. Something closer to fury, and it wasn't aimed at Mason anymore. The judge didn't just deny Denning's custody motion that afternoon. She ordered the documents entered into permanent county record, referred the 14-year drainage diversion to the State Water Rights Enforcement Division for a formal investigation, and set a separate civil hearing for damages, a case that would, over the following months, cost Carl Denning his seat on the drainage board, a substantial settlement, and his standing with a community that had spent over a decade watching him call other men's ruin just physics. He walked out of that courthouse alone. Nobody offered to shake his hand on the way out. The damages settlement came through that winter, enough to clear Mason's loan entirely, replace the equipment lost to 14 years of engineered flooding, and put money aside for Lily's future for the first time since Angela died. Ray didn't disappear after the hearing. He came around most weeks now, quieter, doing the actual work instead of the talking, slowly earning back something he understood he had no right to expect quickly. And the following spring, the State Water Rights Bureau used Mason's case, and the original 1970s easement finally enforced the way it was always supposed to be, to launch a review of every drainage gate along Miller's Fork, protecting a dozen smaller farms from ever facing what Mason's family had quietly absorbed for over a decade. Mason didn't say much when a local reporter asked him about it. He just looked out at the south field, the ground finally dry, Lily running along the fence line chasing something in the grass, and said the only thing that felt true. Water always finds where it's supposed to go. Sometimes it just needs somebody willing to dig. That right there is why we tell these stories. If this one hit you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to The American Farmer. Drop a comment below and tell me, did you see it coming? Because I want to know. We'll see you in the next one.